On July 27th, AD 67, in the second bloodiest battle of the Jewish revolt, the Roman army, led by Vespasian and his son Titus, both soon to be emperors, broke through the defenses of the Galilean hilltop fortress town Josaphat and destroyed 40,000 Judean defenders, many of them having committed suicide at the prospect of being killed or captured by the Romans. By the way, complete side note, I feel very moved by the decision of the Stolpersteiner committee to include the Jews who killed themselves at the prospect of going to, and not to say, they were not martyrs. Verflüchtet in Tod. The general of the Judean army of the Galil and Golan, Yosef ben Matityahu, who is called in France Joseph, and in English Josephus, escaped to a cave with some 40 other prominent citizens of the town. And now I quote, "But when those Jews who had fled with him understood that he yielded to those that invited him to come up," namely the Romans who were saying, "Come out of the cave," they came about him in a body and cried out, "No, indeed, now may the laws of our forefathers, which God ordained himself, well groan to purpose," right? That the Torah would groan. "That God we mean who hath created the souls of the Jews of such a temper that they despise death. O Yosef, art thou still fond of life, and canst thou bear to see the light in a state of slavery? How soon hast thou forgotten thyself? How many hast thou persuaded to lose their lives for liberty? Thou hast therefore had a false reputation for manhood," right? Andrea, Gavriyut, "and a like false reputation for wisdom, if thou canst hope for preservation from those against whom thou hast fought so zealously, and art however willing to be preserved by them, if they be in earnest. But although the good fortune of the Romans hath made thee forget thyself, we ought to take care that the glory of our forefathers may not be tarnished. We will lend thee our right hand and a sword, and if thou wilt die willingly, thou wilt die as general of the Jews, but if unwillingly, thou wilt die as a traitor to them." End quote. Now remember, it is Joseph who gives us this whole speech. We wouldn't know anything about it if he had not given it to us. So I just want to say that his reputation for being a dishonest historian really is a false reputation, because if he were dishonest and just glorifying himself, he would not have given us such an eloquent, and it's in other places as well, such an eloquent speech against him. So Yosef himself made an eloquent speech arguing that it would be evil and wrong for them to kill themselves. Failing, however, to persuade his fellows, Yosef then proposed the following, quote, "However, in this extreme distress, he was not destitute of his usual sagacity, but trusting himself to the providence of God, he put his life into hazard in the manner following. And now, said he, since it is resolved among you that you will die, come on, let us commit our mutual deaths to determination by lot," which means by God. "He whom the lot falls to first, let him be killed by him that hath the second lot, And thus fortune shall make its progress through us all, nor shall any of us perish by his own right hand, for it would be unfair if, when the rest are gone, somebody should repent and save himself. This proposal appeared to them to be very just, and when he had prevailed with them to determine this matter by lots, he drew one of the lots for himself also. He who had the first lot laid his neck bare to him that had the next, as supposing that the general would die among them immediately, for they thought death, if Yosef might but die with them, was sweeter than life. Yet was he with another left to the last, whether we must say it happened so by chance, or whether by the providence of God. This is again Yosef speaking. And as he was very desirous neither to be condemned by the lot, nor, if he had been left to the last, to imbrue, that means to make red, his right hand in the blood of his countrymen, he persuaded him to trust his fidelity to him, to God, and to live as well as himself. Now, taken captive and brought to see the Roman general, Ben Mattatyahu, Josephus, prophesied that Vespasian would one day become emperor. Vespasian subsequently spared the rebel leader, who began collaborating with the Romans, working together with them. At first a slave, he would later be freed upon Vespasian's acclamation as emperor and be granted Roman citizenship as Titus Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus would go on to write several vitally important, if not entirely trustworthy, books of Jewish and Roman imperial history, including the history of the Jewish War, from which alone we know of this incident and his apparently, and I emphasize apparently, craven behavior at Josaphat. Right? A lot of my research, a lot of my writing will be to develop a richer and deeper explanation of Josephus' thinking here, and to at least make a good attempt at exonerating him from cowardice. We have a remarkable situation here, surely not unique, in which the author of the book is one of the main protagonists. Josephus, the author, writes about Josephus, the character. Right? It was a little bit like yesterday when all afternoon I heard people speaking in French about somebody named Daniel BOYARIN, and I had no idea who they were talking about or what they were saying because I don't understand French. My book that I hope to write is not another attempt to narrate the events of the war, so much as an attempt to enliven and render as complex a portrait of the author of the works of Josephus as I can. This portrait comes out in the relay between Josephus the author and Josephus the character, as well as from all that Josephus the author has to say about his life, times, and Jewish history and culture. Josephus the character has been tried and found guilty of treason to his fellows and his people in the courts of opinion of medieval and modern Jews, and in many historians' judgments as well. The most significant historian of the Jews in the Roman Empire, Mary Smallwood, she's, I think, in Oxford, or was, writes, here she writes, Josephus was conceited, not only about his own learning, but also about the opinions held of him as commander both by the Galileans and by the Romans. He was guilty of shocking duplicity at Jotapata, right? So she gives him no explanation, no justification at all. She just calls it shocking duplicity. Saving himself by sacrifice of his companions, he was too naive to see how he stood condemned out of his mouth for his conduct, right? So the fact that he tells us the truth here is just because he was naive and didn't realize that his fellows would condemn him. And yet no words were too harsh when he was blackening his opponents. And after landing, however involuntarily, in the Roman camp, he turned his captivity to his own advantage and benefited for the rest of his days from his change of side. Right? Now, we can see, I'm not going to say this is a totally indefensible view, right? But I do think it's significantly wrong, at the very least, by saying that he benefited for the rest of his days from his change of side, without mentioning that Jews and historians have benefited for the rest of history from his writings, right? So there's something very tendentious in this account. Less scholarly writers than Smallwood have referred to Joseph as the Jewish Benedict Arnold. Perhaps I would tell you who Benedict Arnold is. He was a general of the American revolt against Britain, who at a certain point decided that this revolution was unwinnable. We probably would have been better off if it hadn't been won, frankly. And went over to the English side, right? So, and from the 1920s through the 1970s, it was common to hold trials of Josephus in Zionist educational institutions in Europe, in the US, in Palestine, and eventually Israeli high schools, in which this historical actor and historian was accused by a prosecuting attorney, one of the high school students, and defended either by himself or another, by himself, played by one of the students, or by a public defender appointed by the school. The accusation was clear enough. Josephus was a traitor to his own troops and to the Jewish cause. As a Jewish betrayer of the cause of Jewish independence in the land of Israel, it is not surprising that in most of these Zionist high school mock trials, Josephus was convicted of the charge of high treason. I was more surprised to discover that occasionally he was acquitted. He was acquitted if he had a very, very, very intelligent defense attorney. Josephus has even gone down into the history of mathematics as the putative inventor of what is known until today as the Josephus permutation. Namely, given a group of men arranged in a circle, under the edict that every third man will be executed going around the circle until only one remains, find the position in which you should stand in order to be the last survivor. The suggestion, of course, is that his survival was calculated and not merely fortuitous. Only adds to the air of moral rot that attends the story. The key term here in all of these accusations is condemned out of his own mouth. In other words, he was intelligent enough to figure out mathematically how to arrange that he would be the last man standing. But at the same time, he was so stupid as to realize that telling us this story would condemn him out of his own mouth. Why would this man have condemned himself out of his own mouth, as well as out of the mouths of his compatriots in that cave? This seems to me the crucial question of this Jewish life, Josephus's, for his Jewish life. Certain contemporary historians have enjoined us that to understand a culture, go to the most confounding, the most nubby and intractable moment that we find and try our best to parse that. The same applies to the decoding of a life story. How can it possibly make sense to imagine Joseph, without any apparent shame, telling us a story of what seems to us such a naked betrayal of trust? In my proposed biography, which I hope to write as the Gutenberg holder of the Gutenberg Chaire, I do not intend to condemn Josephus nor to praise and defend him, but to try to understand him better and present his life in a new key, perhaps to unlock the code of his life. I will begin the story of his life with the Battle of Josaphat, exposing what I take to be the key to unlock at least some of its meanings. I will provide a dramatic narrative of these events, while also presenting Josephus's accounts of what was said and thought by the other participants in the drama. I will suggest that in presenting so eloquently and with such deep sympathy the surely fictional words of his antagonists, as well as his own claims and self-understanding, Josephus is presenting us with the pivotal dilemma of his life, a dilemma from which he never escaped and which generates so much of his life and writing after these events as well. The horns of the dilemma. I suggest that Josephus's presentation of his own life and actions are a sort of allegory for the large historical questions that he has posed through his life and through his own self-reported speech to the other actors in the historical drama. From a personal standpoint, his dilemma is whether it is better to die as a free man without having bended the knee, or to continue living a Jewish life as best one can under the yoke of an occupying power. And that's a true dilemma. But in the larger context of Jewish history, it illuminates the dilemma of whether it is better for the people, le peuple, to sacrifice themselves and their temple entirely in order to remain free, or to bend the knee to Roman domination in order to keep the nation and its worship alive. These are the horns of the Josephian dilemma, time and the war of ideas that form the background to Josephus's own moral dilemmas. At the heart of his own ambivalence must be the question of the revolt itself and his judgment of it. The dominant voice in the Josephus writing in Rome is condemnatory of the zealots and of the rebellion, and blames them for all the disasters that befell his countryside and country folk, including the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. This is illustrated in the following text. Josephus himself has been sent by Titus, much later of course, to speak to the Judeans defending the city. He is attempting to persuade the rebels to surrender rather than see Jerusalem and the temple destroyed. To be sure, he writes, it might be proper to have contempt for low masters, not those under whose hand was everything. Right? So if we were under the control of low status masters, people of no culture and who had not been favored, then it might make sense to revolt. For what place had escaped the Romans except that either through heat or cold was unprofitable, right? The Romans had conquered the whole world except where it was too cold or too hot to bother. For fortune had passed over to them from all sides, and God, bringing around to each nation the empire, was now with the Italians. There is indeed an ordained law most powerful among animals and humans. Give way to those who are stronger, and the command is for those who are at the acme with arms. That is why their ancestors, who were in soul and body and also in other resources better, gave way to the Romans, which had they not known God was with them, with the Romans, they would not have dared. Now this is a passionate, both reasoned and theological call to abandon arms in the struggle against the Romans, since clearly God had ordained them to rule over Israel at this time. Zealotry, martyrdom, abandoning oneself entirely to the cause of Judean independence, risking life and limb, wife, children, and home, not to mention the temple, seemed nothing but foolish and even sacrilegious in this speech, and passim in the war. Just before this passage, indeed, Josephus brings out a theme that recurs several times within the war, namely the responsibility of the rebels for the destruction of the temple. Right? This is Josephus writing, so if he mentions somebody named Josephus, he is talking about his own self, of course. Josephus accordingly circled the wall, and striving to keep out of the range of their missiles, but within hearing, at different positions, appealed to them, to the Jews, repeatedly to spare their country and their temple, and not to show themselves more indifferent to their fate than were the aliens. The Romans, he urged, although they had no share in them, yet respected the holy places of their enemies, and until now had kept their hands off them, while those who had been brought up in them, in the temple and the holy places, and if they were kept safe from injury, would be the only ones to enjoy these holy places, were actually determined to destroy them by continuing the hopeless fight. Not only then do the rebels, and especially the zealots, risk their own lives and limbs and their families and countrymen in continuing this war, but they also are the ones who will be responsible for the destruction, for the burning of the temple itself. Josephus repeats this accusation against the leaders of the revolt even more forcefully just a few pages later. It was they, the zealots, who overthrew the city and compelled the unwilling Romans to be credited with so melancholy a triumph, and almost drew the tardy flames to the temple. It is paradoxically the very defenders of the liberty of the city and the defenders of its inviolability who bring down the destruction and the burning of the temple. If this were all we had of Josephus, it would be easy to understand him as simply blaming the rebels for all the evil that befell Judea and the Judeans, especially for the destruction of the Holy of Holies, the Temple of Jerusalem. But at the same time, there are contradictions. Josephus can appear at other junctures as moved and highly admiring of such extremism in resistance. Previous historians have regarded these contradictions as the product of the use by Josephus of different sources that contradict each other. In other words, once again, by simply declaring him some kind of a naive dummy, right? This man who supposedly was able in the second to calculate where he was supposed to stand in order to be the last man, was incapable of realizing how grossly he contradicts himself by quoting different authors, by using different authors in his writing, and how naive he is by not realizing how history will judge him if he tells us these stories. I see this not as a result of his careless use of such sources, but of his own divided affect. And this is the crucial point I want to make, that Josephus was inconsistent indeed because he was in an ambivalent state of mind for his whole life, admiring the great militant fight for liberty on one hand, but at the same time certain that it would lead to the virtual destruction, as it did, of the Jewish or Judean polity in Palestine, rendering himself sometimes zealot sympathizer, but most often a member of the peace party. More than occasionally, we find Josephus admiring even the most extreme forms of resistance unto death, and even the killing of one's children in the name of liberty. Josephus's stories of suicide rather than surrender of Jews to Romans exemplify this double voice within Josephus. And by a double voice within Josephus, I don't mean a double voice within his texts. I mean a double voice in his beten. In his kishkis, yeah. But I was afraid if I said kishkis, people would realize that I'm Jewish. So A fine example is Josephus' account of an old rebel in the Galilee, sacrificing his wife, children, and himself rather than fall under the Roman yoke. Even before the war against the Romans under Pompey, there were Jewish rebels against Herod. These rebels installed themselves with their families in seemingly impregnable hillside caves in the Galilee. But Herod outsmarted them. Quote, "Yet did he at length make use of a contrivance that was subject to the utmost hazard, for he let down the most hardy of his men in chests and set them at the mouths of the caves in which the rebels were hiding. Now these men slew the robbers and their families," right? These Herodian brave soldiers, and when they, the brigands, made resistance, they sent in fire upon them and burnt them. And as Herod was desirous of saving some of them, he had proclamation made that they should come and deliver themselves up to him, but not one of them willingly came to him. And of those that were compelled to come, many preferred death to captivity. And here a certain old man, the father of 7 children, whose children together with their mother desired him to give them leave to go out, upon the assurance and right hand that was offered them, he slew them after the following manner. He ordered every one of them to go out, while he stood himself at the cave's mouth, and slew that son of his perpetually who went out. Right? So as the children come to the gate, thinking that they are going to go free with the Romans, Herod was near enough to see this sight, and his bowels of compassion were moved at it, and he stretched out his right hand to the old man and besought him to spare his children. Yet did not he relent at all upon what he said, but over and over reproached Herod on the lowness of his descent, and slew his wife as well as his children. And when he had thrown their dead bodies down the precipice, he at last threw himself down after him. Now, whatever you want to say about it, I don't believe this is Josephus copying from some other historian without realizing what he is saying. Right? What I believe is that he, like many of us, wakes up one morning admiring militants and resistance and the pain of death, and we wake up another morning and say, we wish that those rebels would just make peace and continue to live. Right? While our own values might clearly lead us to sympathy with the wife and children, importuning their father to let them live, of course that is our own misericordia, it seems clear enough that Josephus, torn as he might be, bears enormous admiration for those who prefer death for themselves and their families rather than submission to the thinly disguised Romans here. Right? I'm claiming that Herod's soldiers are a kind of allegory of the Romans. Now, notice the precise analog here as in the narrative of Yodafat, of the outstretched right hand to rescue from the cave. But Josephus wanted to accept this proffered right hand, while the old man of Galilee proudly refuses it. It is hard to imagine Josephus, the author, was not aware of this explicitly contradictory allusion. This self-contradiction or dilemma is rendered only the sharper then when we think of it in the context of Josephus's own behavior, in the context of such steadfastness for liberty or death. This comment might make more sense to Americans, but I'll say it, and then maybe if someone wants to translate it into French, they're welcome to. Patrick Henry was a great American hero of the Civil War, and he is famous for having said, "Give me liberty or give me death." So he's the great martyred hero. And it is only recently that we are discovering that he bought and sold African slaves and treated them extremely cruelly. So what is the virtue of liberty if that is what, so it's possible to have all kinds of ambivalence. Josephus inscribes these moments of apparent esteem for the most zealous of the rebels. I would remind once more, when Josephus is already in Rome, already the client of Vespasian and Titus. In other words, you can't say that he was just, when he was writing to the Jews, he admired the rebels, but when he was speaking to the Romans, he condemned them, because this was written in Rome, in Vespasian's house. They are all the more indicative, I would suggest, of the complexities of his mental state, as manifest in the text, however precisely we are inclined to interpret that state. What could he have been thinking as he writes admiring accounts of the martyr and sacrificer of his children, while he remembered what he had done at Yodafat? The impassioned speech above of Josephus in favor of abandoning the war goes directly counter to the texts we have just seen, admiring these rebels. If here he admires without qualification the priests who serve at the altar as they are being killed, the rebel who sacrifices his children to the lost cause, the final zealot holdouts in Egypt who won't give up or give in, there he counsels surrender to the Romans, since it is clear that they will win. Rome is God's tool to scourge Israel for her sins. But God does not desire, according to this second Josephan voice, dead martyred priests, but living Judeans who will recognize his rule through the Romans and continue to sacrifice in the temple. Josephus, of course, made his own personal choice based on this latter counsel. having failed to persuade the other Judeans of the justice of his argument, what is remarkable is to what extent he allows the position of the rebel, rejectionist, extremist, fanatic to shine through as well. Right? Equivocation is the language of dilemma. Historian Steve Mason has made a fine beginning in articulating the situation of Josephus in Rome. Namely, where the Flavians portrayed the Jewish war as a great triumph for Rome and its generals, Josephus was insistent on reading it as God's punishment of the Jews for their sins, and Rome as the mere instrument of his wrath. A kind of continuation of the Deuteronomistic theology. And even Josephus' own capitulation to the Romans can be given two readings. Titus's, in which the Roman force put down a rebellious subject state, and Josephus's, in which Rome was a tool of God, and the defeat of the Judeans was preordained as a punishment for them. Josephus' account of the war is a Judean story told by a Jerusalem aristocrat from a Judean vantage point on history, one informed by prophetic themes and interpretations, and at the same time it is a story of accommodation to the Romans. Josephus expresses his dilemma as well through a kind of verbal equivocation, language that can be given two precisely opposite interpretations. Whatever his precise motivation, Josephus was clearly aware of the possibility of such doublespeak, to use George Orwell's term. For example, Josephus uses the word denos, right? I imagine many of you are familiar with this Greek word, denos, to refer to the priests in Jerusalem continuing to sacrifice as their co-priests were being massacred. This word means both wonderful and terrible, horrifying. So when he says denos, he is saying from his speech point that this was both wonderful that they continued to sacrifice, but it was also horrifying and terrible. The same word. So you could say he either gives us a choice how to interpret it, or he wants us to live as readers in that ambiguity that burned in his in his soul. One way of understanding this doublespeak would be that Josephus is indeed sending a double message, one to the Jews who read his works and one to the Romans who might be reading. For the former, for the Jews, it would be thrilling and wonderful, for the Romans, terrible and horrifying. I prefer, however, a more complex mode of reading in line with the general interpretation of Josephus, the Jew, that I am working out in this research. According to this second mode of explanation, this is a more internal process. Josephus himself is of divided mind. We're close to the end. I always like to comfort people who are sitting in those hard chairs that this torture will have an end. This would render his ambiguity here, Josephus's ambiguity in using a word like denos. And he repeats this gesture many times. If it were just once, we could say it's it's an accident. But I have many examples. This would render his ambiguity precisely that which literary critic William Empson has deemed the seventh type of ambiguity. In his classic book, 7 Types of Ambiguity, Empson has carefully and with great nuance analyzed and articulated 7 ways in which ambiguous meanings in poetry and artistic prose relate to each other semantically. The 7th type of ambiguity classified by him, by Empson, quote, occurs when the 2 meanings of the word, the 2 values of the ambiguity, are the 2 opposite meanings defined by the context, so that the total effect is to show a fundamental division in the writer's mind. I don't know any examples in French, I'm afraid, but I give you a good example in English. To cleave means to separate, even to cut with an axe, but it also means to attach oneself to, right? In exact opposites. There are other examples in English as well, but this is perhaps one of the most famous ones. So if a poet writes cleave, right? Cleave thyself. So in writing expository prose, it would be a bad thing to do. But in writing poetry or in writing a kind of artistic prose, such as Josephus writes, so to say that something is denos is to say that something is, that one must cleave in English, precisely to expose the ambiguity through the ambivalence through the ambiguity of the wording. According to this view, which I hope to develop, Josephus here once again indicates his inability to escape from the dilemma of the double bind between absolute integrity and liberty that leads to death for individuals, for himself, for the temple, for Jerusalem, or for the Jewish people entire, and the choice to compromise integrity in order that the people will continue in some, at least partial, fashion. There are, moreover, several more very rich and almost certainly deliberate examples of this type of ambiguity in Josephus's history. One way of thinking about this would be to contrast the American slogans of "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" with another American slogan, "Better red than dead." Right? In the midst of the hysteria about Stalin's momentary takeover of the United States and the necessity to build up bomb reserves and missiles, and young people of my caste of mind marched under the slogan, "Better red than dead." Josephus, it seems, was good for thinking with in Jewish modernity, as it seems he had been for millennia among Christians as well, right? Remember, Josephus was practically unknown to Jews until the early modern period. I will argue that part of what makes him so rich a figure, both as the subject of his writings and for the authorial voice that he produces, is precisely those deep strata of ambivalence buried within the text of his histories and his other writings. Perhaps the most wonderful thing about the life of this Jew, Josephus, is the way that he speaks to our own ambivalences about Jewish life, power, relations with others, war and peace, diaspora, and sovereignty. There is a lot at stake, it seems, in reading and writing the life of this Jew, and more of it has to do with Josephus the person, the Jew, than with Josephus the historian. And so I'm not intending to write yet another account of the Jewish war using Josephus as a source. It's the only source we have. I actually hope to write some kind of a life of this man, Josephus, this supposed traitor to Judaism and to the Jews, who wrote an 18-book history of the Jews, which is totally a defense, who wrote against Appian, another defense of the Torah against attacks, and maybe even more significantly, married 4 women during his life, and every single one of them was a Jewish woman. Right? He insisted, even when Vespasian was going to give him a wife, that he only wanted a Jewish wife. So something doesn't sit with the story of Josephus, who abandoned the Jews, who was the traitor, who was... It just doesn't fit together, that standard story. And I think that this narrative that I propose to develop, at least as one possibility of a life of Josephus, in which I attempt to follow as closely as possible his affect, his emotions, and the dilemmas, the moral dilemmas that he enacted through his rhetoric and through his practices, might give us a Josephus for our time.
Schalfu tzarim charbam libam, chafu dvarim lochen bekirbam, shadedu arim nevion bribam, kire samtiv kana, konenu yetarim lachtot mrivam, vestafu chaverim afar borbam, umipaz yekarim dakrub charbam, chatetzam lelibam tfalachna, umama chalfu bilem, nima
Rot
תצלחנה, נעצו רטוטים כבים דוברות, חשלו קרוצים במעבר גרות, האמת מכסים אך לחרות, עברות וראשם תאגרנה. ומאמרות הגוביהם, נרמה בתוך בוקרביהם, סרצינה מעליהם, דברים גמם תצחנה, זרע נדון בנותם, דיברו מדון על עיתם, עלמו בזדון ישפטם.